Hey everybody, it's Jason Sheftel, and it's time to talk about everybody's favorite Chinese global strategy to sort of basically try and take over the world. That's kind of the underlying strategy of China's Belt and Road Initiative, right? This has been now over almost 10 years with this whole program, and it's morphed in so many different ways, and we'll talk about what it really is, what it is supposedly supposed to be on the surface, and just kind of why it's basically fundamentally wrong on how it's supposed to work, on the whole strategic goals, on how it would work economically, and all the leverage and the debt stuff, like all this stuff that people have been so scared about. Mostly it just doesn't work. So let's get into it. So the first thing to know is that the Belt and Road is actually really taking advantage of a real global need around the world, and that is the need for infrastructure, right? Most of the world does not have anything like the infrastructure Americans take for granted. And the two main areas where there's an investment gap between the infrastructure that countries need and the infrastructure they have tends to be in transportation and energy, right? And this makes a lot of sense because you basically need those two things to modernize and industrialize. And there's also all sorts of other things. There's water, there's sewage, there's all sorts of treatment stuff, there's basic industrial processes, there's all sorts of things that are needed, but energy and transportation are two big ones. And so around 2013, 2014, China came out with a grand strategy to basically solve or appear to solve a lot of this problem for various countries all around the world. And so just on that, it kind of sounds like a good plan, right? Everybody remembers the U.S. Marshall Plan, where it sort of helped to rebuild Europe, and that was a great thing, and it's remembered very well, and look how well Europe is doing. Well, now you fast forward to the 2010s, and it seemed like China was about to do its grand strategic gambit, kind of like the United States, where it would build massive global infrastructure, and then that would tie all these countries to China, and that would lead to basically a new Chinese system, and the U.S. would be booted out of this, and there would be a new global world order and all that kind of stuff. But that was kind of the general way it was presented, and it was not the Chinese government did not dissuade that sort of understanding, and that's where we are. So this strategic gambit to counter the U.S. system, okay, fair enough. There was a need for the infrastructure. The U.S. wasn't doing it. Maybe if China stepped in, this was possible. Okay, fair enough. And what this meant on the ground was basically, all right, the Belt and Road are basically, the belt is sort of like a bunch of overland infrastructure that would lead to various parts of Eurasia. So it was not even Eurasia, just all over. It would kind of radiate out from China, and it would go through parts of Central Asia, it would go to Europe, and it would go through Pakistan, it would go through, Burma and parts of Southeast Asia, and just kind of go all around the world, sort of spider out from China. And then the road, ironically, was sort of more of a maritime thing, which we'll get into in a little bit. But the gist of all of this, the core stuff that China needed to build, isn't actually anything related to the sea. It's all overland stuff, right? And when this was really presented, it was originally phrased as something like, the New Silk Road, right? And the idea was, okay, this Grand Silk Road, which connected the rest of the world to China back in the day, way back in the day. And this whole thing is the Silk Road is also one of the most overhyped things in all of world history, especially Chinese history. This thing is not what people thought it was. And in another video, I will actually just break down some of why this is just not at all something that should be thought of the way it is. I mean, this is the Silk Road, and this whole idea of Silk Roads and all that was basically a way for academic historians in the late 20th and early 21st century to sort of jump on something to help their careers. It was really a super minor thing throughout history, but that's for another episode. Right now, we're just going to talk about this whole overland trade infrastructure that China wanted to build and why this is just a really bad investment idea in the first place. Like, there's a reason there is an infrastructure gap. Like, if you go read stuff from the OECD or the UN or the IMF or any of these institutions that are focused on global development around the world, you'll see, wow, most countries don't have basic infrastructure people in the United States take for granted, and they have no plan to get to a place where they would have that infrastructure. And so these institutions will look and they'll say, okay, well, there's a need for probably to raise you to the level of infrastructure that we think would make you more functional and blah, 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 get you into the advanced economy camp. You would need all this stuff, right? And so they measure, they calculate how much all that would cost, theoretically, and you see this gap, right? Problem is that this stuff is really, really expensive, and it actually has to pay off, right? You actually need this stuff to pay off. So China, part of what it's doing with this whole plan was like, well, we will pay for it, right? That was sort of the basic idea, right? Well, no one was paying for this stuff, and just because you declare an initiative doesn't mean that Zambia can suddenly afford a port, right? You actually have to pay for all this. You have to pay for a new railroad to a engineering facility, or to a resource extraction facility, or whatever it is. You have to pay for all of this. So China had to pay for all of it. And the real question is this a good investment, right? There's a big investment gap, but often there's a big investment gap, whether people want to admit it or not, because maybe these things aren't great investments. And so the core reason why China's enormous Belt and Road Initiative is going to fail as a massive strategic investment strategy is because it is a series of extremely, extremely bad investments that the rest of the world did not bother to do, right? And there are a lot of valuable, good things that just didn't have the capital to do it, but there are far, far, far more just terrible ideas. And there's a basic, general, overarching reason why this is a bad idea. And the basic reason is because overland trade, the grand global belt that China wanted to create, through Kazakhstan, through Pakistan, through all these places, it's a terrible, terrible, inefficient means of moving things, and it is far, far worse than maritime trade, right? So basically, sending things by train or sending things on a truck or anything else that you can think of that goes on land is way worse than doing it at sea. And the reasons are pretty obvious, right? You don't need any infrastructure at sea, right? So there's no infrastructure you need for a ship to float on the water, right? You just need ships and you need ports. That's it. And obviously you need infrastructure that, basically the multimodal infrastructure that lets you take a container from one type of transportation and you move it from one to the other, right? So you take a container that's on a ship, and that container can go onto a crane, can be brought down into the port, it can be put on a truck, it can be trucked to a facility where it can be put onto a train, et cetera, et cetera. This grand innovation, really a really phenomenal, important innovation of human life in the late 20th century, and that enabled globalization, was this multimodal infrastructure that developed. It originally started with a guy, I can't remember his name, McClellan or whatever, but it was a company called Sealand, and it was a guy who was in the old trucking industry and basically had an idea to move things from trucks to boats and make the process efficient. Eventually this spread around the world, and this made the global transportation network that we take for granted and that enables globalization, and made all that possible. So that's a really important thing. But at sea, again, you have containers, you have ships, and you have ports, and that's all you need. There is no massive infrastructure at sea. There's no tolls at sea. There's no middlemen at sea. There's no fixed routes. It's extremely flexible. You're not stuck on a track that brings you only in one direction or another in one way with all these fixed tables. It's extremely flexible, and most importantly, it enables you to have enormous scale, right? So the largest container ships, like something like that Evergreen that knocked itself into the Suez Canal, these ships can carry over 20,000 containers. Some of the new Evergreen, actually, I don't know if I said Evergrande, but Evergrande is the company in China that's having a lot of problems. Evergreen is the shipping company, and Evergreen has some ships that I'm pretty sure they have 24,000, almost 25,000 containers now. That is insane. Compare this to anything on land, right? A truck, for example, which you create road infrastructure to use it in a cargo transportation context. That's one, maybe two or whatever containers. Trains, which are better, maybe a couple dozens or a few hundred, often, around 200, 250 or something is a very big load in the United States. Because just think about it, you have a long, linear, snaking creature that, you don't have stacked trains with 10 level container cargo load, right? You don't have one stacked on top of each other. You just have one long linear thing. And there's a strong limit on how long these can be, right? You can't go more than 10,000 feet or so at most. So obviously 40-foot container, you could just do the math, but it doesn't matter. You don't get that many containers versus these cargo ships. The cargo ships that are doing over 20,000, this is over 100 times more stuff, right? 200, 2,000, 20,000. I mean, these are economies of scale that you just cannot get in overland transportation, especially when they're also so fixed and inflexible, where you have not only do you have the single track, but the track can go through multiple countries. You could have multiple stops. You could have multiple middlemen. The poorer and the less developed these countries are, the more corruption, the more bribes you're doing along the way, the more problems you have with all the maintenance. Because not only do you have to build all this stuff, which is very expensive, you have to build and maintain it forever to keep it up to speed. If you have a little piece of it that's broken, the whole thing breaks down. The ocean doesn't break down, right? So you add in also obviously labor costs and all the stuff that goes along with it. It is just worse, straight up, period. All this overland stuff is inferior to water transportation. And this is why, according to the OECD, according to everybody, according to common sense, over 90% of trade and shipping happens at sea. And that's the way it's been, particularly for the last 500 years, with the whole European empires globalizing the world and opening up all these maritime trade routes. And this is actually the story of Chinese history in part of the last 500 years, is responding to this problem and to some earlier ones. But even deeper, water transportation is what makes the great civilizations in the great river valleys of the world possible for especially the ones that let you do water transport. So whether that's the Nile or that's all the German rivers, the Elbe, if it doesn't matter if it's in the Mississippi, it doesn't matter if it's the Yangtze, it's everywhere. This is the core of why things happen, and you can't escape water transportation and try and basically make super flat land, just flatten the earth to make something better. Buoyancy is just superior, right? The reason you get that 100x improvement in the capacity of the cargo at sea is just because you can float it, and it's cheaper, and it's easier, and you basically get the benefit of all the surface tension and the displaced water, and it just does the work for you. So that is the absolute key thing to know. There's no way to escape this, right? So there's this global infrastructure gap that China and everyone kind of rightly knows. As you go to, it's really horrific. You go to a lot of really poor countries, and you'll see that they don't have basic things that you take for granted and that you haven't even thought about for years, because you've just assumed it would always be there and always work. And that is not the case, particularly for energy and transportation all around the world. So there is this real need for stuff, but the really core infrastructure element to this transportation, connectivity, let's connect the world, recenter it, particularly around China, radiate it out of China, take advantage of the massive productive scale China has to create all this stuff. This just doesn't work unless you can account for the fact that the maritime element is the key to everything, right? And so the road, ironically, the road part of the Belt and Road name was actually more associated with maritime trade. But here is the problem. So yeah, you can say you have a maritime Belt and Road or whatever, but this doesn't mean anything. This doesn't actually mean anything. It is functionally, like I said, there is an infrastructure that needs to be built outside of basically ports, right? So yeah, actually you do need, again, there's also, what's happened to the Belt and Road is it's just become this generalized investment program where there's just all sorts of Chinese various agencies and banks and everyone just kind of dipping their fingers in all sorts of things that might be useful to the Chinese state. It's become a generalized investment branded thing, because quickly they found out that there was not nearly as many good opportunities in the core areas it was looking for. And particularly with the maritime stuff, all you need are ports, right? So China can build ports, right? And actually China has way more deep water port construction expertise than basically anyone else. It had to build a lot of ports in China, and it's built an insane number of ports, far more ports than China even needs. So it's actually very, very good at this, and it could create deep water ports, whether you want it in anywhere in the east coast of Africa, parts of South Asia. It's really anywhere, and that's fine. The problem is this doesn't create a new global system. All you're doing is adding a new node into the larger global shipping network that already exists. And these new nodes aren't going to be major pieces of it, because these aren't developed, advanced countries that are going to add a lot with their high income consumption or production. This is largely, in China's case, particularly like all over Africa, basically the only ports and railroads that it was building was just to connect to some inland resource that it needed. It built a facility to process it. It built a railroad to ship it, and then it built a port to ship it back to China, right? So it's actually as neo-colonial as you can get in that sense. But the key thing here is that this doesn't actually build any new system. This is just adding a few ports that might be useful to China, and that is far, far less of a grand strategy than anyone is really willing to admit. And so really what you get with this is is a useful strategy to get some resources, maybe build some relationships, secure some dependencies, secure some influence, and that's really about it. And Sri Lanka is an example that people always bring up. This is a country that China, well, it's a country, right? below India, the southern tip of India, and it is not a very developed country. And China decided to build a port there. It financed this port. Sri Lanka could not pay for the port, so China got a 99-year lease on the port, right? But the thing is, it's so backwards what China's doing. It's actually, this is something the British Empire did actually in China with with Hong Kong and other things as well. And Hong Kong being the most notable example. But the problem is this might feel really good in China, like, oh wow, look, we can do what the British Empire did in some bizarre, again, neo-colonial sort of thing. But the truth is that era has passed. To have a 99-year lease in a random place like Sri Lanka, this is not helpful in an economic sense. This might be helpful for some grand military conflict or contest you want to have with India, but Sri Lanka is really far away. You have to, the key problem for all of this, and the reason why there's no maritime system that China could ever run is because China does not have the navy to actually do this. It doesn't have a navy that can even go to Sri Lanka to secure anything, to enforce anything, right? So you look at the United States, it has a maritime global system that it runs. This is actually the key infrastructure that makes all this stuff possible, in addition to aviation and stuff. But primarily it's the sea. And that's why you have a giant U.S. Navy that goes everywhere, all over the time. It has giant nuclear carriers, and you could say what you want about missiles and how they're going to make all this stuff obsolete, but that's fine. But it's enabled an entire system to run, and you can't actually have that system without the Navy because you have no way to actually assert your hold on anything, right? So, and that's actually going to play out because China's realizing that a lot of these leases, a lot of these debts that it incurred on all these countries, if they don't pay them back, you can't force them to pay them back, right? Yeah, you can you can own the infrastructure you built, but what does that actually get you, right? You just built and financed something in a random country, and all it takes is a change in the political leadership, a change in economic fortunes, a change in all sorts of things to disrupt all your investments. I mean, China has basically been doing the Belt and Road through very obscure sort of bilateral agreements that are not well known, the actual particulars of them, between China and all sorts of countries, or Chinese agencies in all sorts of countries. And you have to enforce these all one by one, right? There's no system actually involved in this at all, right? So the actual Belt and Road Initiative isn't like a grand framework, even though it's touted as such. It's really just a bunch of small bilateral investment agreements, not even bilateral investment agreements, which are often done between countries. This is just investment contracts for specific facilities and goods and stuff like that. It is way, way less than it is made out to be. And obviously, at the end, it was supposed to all come together into some grand system, but the truth is, on the ground, it was never implemented in that way. So at one level, you can say this is a giant Chinese misread of how the U.S. actually built this global system that China is still a part of, right? And what the U.S. did was it built an economic and security alliance built around primarily giving people access to the large U.S. consumer economy, protecting the trade flows and investment flows that go between the U.S. and all these other countries and all the other countries that are aligned with the U.S. and each other, and then obviously having that security blanket that sort of ties everything together. And the key thing is that, yes, building infrastructure is important, right? But there isn't a comprehensive structure here. The countries that China is involving itself with, these don't add up to something that is greater, pieces that are greater than the whole, right? A lot of the main places for the Belt and Road are a bunch of East African countries. There's also Pakistan, there's Kazakhstan, there's Myanmar, there's Malaysia. I mean, there's obviously all sorts of places, but this doesn't add up into anything. And all of these countries, a lot of them, they're either part of the U.S. system, and China's not offering them anything better than what they have. They're the overall deal that they have. So there's that, or they're also just countries that are kind of exiles and pariah states and backwaters, or really just kind of horrific places in a lot of ways. It's like, okay, that's not going to add up to much, right? And the horrible thing is just that, yes, there's this whole investment need, and China is filling it. But what these countries are also doing, they're also playing their own game. They're saying, oh, China will build this thing, and then that's great, and we'll have this loan, but I don't know, we won't get it built anyway, so I guess we'll take this loan. And then, yeah, you can sort of trap them for years, hypothetically, or most likely, these countries aren't going to pay in the end, right? And China's just going to end up building themselves stuff that maybe they get to keep, maybe they don't, but they're just taking advantage of the deal while it's there, right? No one else was going to build this infrastructure. And China is as China is learning throughout the Chinese interior, right, where China has been hyper investing in infrastructure for so long, this isn't enough by itself. Infrastructure isn't enough by itself. It is actually an enabling resource. It's kind of like finance, where we live in a world where both infrastructure and finance, which are meant to help support the real economic activity, they are not economic activity in and of themselves. Obviously, they are in some sense, but to have it be a durable, resilient economic system, you need self-sustaining high incomes. You need further investments that make use of the infrastructure that allow you to repay those debts in the first place, right? The idea of investing in something, or even taking a loan, is that, okay, I don't have the capital now and I have a little shortage, so I'm going to basically rent that money from someone else, and then I'm going to repay them with the future income that came from the investment I was able to make using the money that I was loaned. That is the whole process, right? That is the basic process of finance. And if that isn't what happens, if you have all these countries that don't pay, what you're learning is that this wasn't investment that led to that activity in the first place. And this is something I can go into another episode, but there is a misunderstanding about how development around the world happens, where it happens, where it does, why it happens, why it does, and why it doesn't happen, right? So everyone assumes that if you just invest enough anywhere, this is just going to develop into a advanced country, but that's just not true, right? There's maybe 25 countries on Earth that are really advanced, like you want to say, that like people would all agree with. And there's a lot of people, lot more countries that are not, and that aren't going to be there. And there's just hosts and swaths of countries that are totally undeveloped and aren't going to develop based using what we know and have today in economic and technological capacity. It's just not going to happen. And a big reason why is what you see in China, where once you hit a certain investment level, it doesn't matter how much debt you put into it or how much new infrastructure you put into it, you just don't get growth out of these regions. And there's huge, like almost dead zones in the Chinese economy where they've pumped so much debt into the system, they've built so much infrastructure, but it hasn't led to anything. And it is a horrifying thing when you see it in China. And what's happening is that this is going to happen elsewhere, right? And the ultimate truth is that the land part of this in particular, the sea part, building ports, that's fine. Ports, a lot of the ports in China are actually going to just rust away eventually. So that's likely in a lot of other countries. But with the land bridges, these are just the roads, all the rail systems. These are just essentially bridges to nowhere, right? This is that infrastructure investment that is mocked in the United States, where people will build a random bridge in Alaska from one island with no people to like another island with 4 people, and nothing happens, and it's a giant waste, and that's just what happens. And what actually happens as economies start to slow their growth is you actually get more and more of this because countries are trying to juice things to be what they once were. Japan is a really great example of this, where in the 1990s, Japan was doing so much in infrastructure investment. It was mind-boggling at the time. Now China's just made it look like peanuts. But back then it was insane, and it was building all this stuff, and they was getting nothing out of it. And there's a lot of great studies and research into like what happened and why this didn't work. And what China has done is it brought all of what Japan did and did it like 10 times more. It did 10 times more of this investment everywhere within China. And actually what you see is that what China was really doing with this Belt and Road Initiative, yes, there's investment, yes, there's a global strategy, that's fine. But what it was also doing was it was continuing to export all of this infrastructure that it no longer could even build in China. So it had all of these industries in construction, in ports, in factories, skyscrapers, energy, everything, that you didn't have the projects in China anymore, but it could not allow these workforces, allow these skills, allow these industries to just atrophy and start dying away. So what China started to do is just export all of this around the world, right? And so that's part of the reason China's not paying as much attention to whether these things pencil out, because it just wants to keep building things, right? What it's doing is what Japan did in the 90s, it brought that 10x farther and just built even more infrastructure in China. And then when it started to run out of infrastructure in China in the 2010s, it started to just build all the infrastructure all around the world because it just couldn't stop, because it would undermine its entire economic system. So that's really some of what's going on. And if you just want to imagine what this is going to mean for other countries, just think about it. Who is going to use some expensive closed system that runs through a host of unstable and unfriendly countries like Pakistan and Kazakhstan and all sorts of other stands, and right, or Burma, and all these places where there's just endless coups and political instability, social tensions, economic distress. This is a farce. I mean, it's absurd is what this is. And what people are going to continue to do is try and ship things by sea, where they can get 100 times the economies of scale and do it far cheaper, far more flexibly, and far more freely, as long as you can, well, as long as there's no pirates that come out suddenly and the U.S. Navy decides to just head back to North America and all these countries start warring with each other. That would be a different thing. But in the current world, why on earth would you go with this Chinese system, right? That's the basic thing. And like I said, what this is really doing is trying to keep the Chinese economy humming. And that's basically what it's doing. And China's learning right now some very hard lessons about loans and debt diplomacy and how all sorts of stuff across Southeast Asia and Africa, even parts of Latin America and stuff, all these loans it's making, it isn't exactly a winning strategy to give loans to people who can't or won't pay you back. The idea that you could transform that into some sort of like leverage strategy is dubious at best and horrifically financially foolish at worst. And so that is it. And what's happened even more is because China needed to move away from this investment strategy, right? This endless overinvestment strategy. It needed to not do what Japan did. And instead, it used the Belt and Road in part to just keep expanding this insane overinvestment problem that it has been dealing with for years, over a decade, over 15 years now. I mean, if you really go back, it's even more than that in all sorts of industries, but it's just been kind of recycled and reconfigured over and over again. But that is the truth, right? This is the truth about the Belt and Road. It isn't going to work. Maritime trade is still better. Maritime trade doesn't need infrastructure, and all the connecting infrastructure that you could build, you can build, but you're not going to get control over these countries in the process. Countries are going to use you to balance out, to play games and deal with their own internal political challenges and their own neighbors and their own balancing of the U.S. or other countries that are far afield. And they're going to try and play their own game. And they're not going to just join into some system that you have. You have to give them a much, much better deal, right? And this is not at all some sort of global Marshall Plan that's going to recreate a new Chinese world order and replace the United States one. It is a farce, and it's even pulling back to the British Empire strategy, which isn't going to work in the modern world, where the U.S. did give at least a 10x better strategy to anyone that was involved or associated with the British Empire, right? Look at Australia, look at New Zealand, look at all these places that were literally part of the British Empire and have now totally ditched it, right? And obviously the British Empire is gone, but the part of the reason that it could disappear is all these countries basically got a better deal than they had with the British by just hitching to the United States, including the Great Britain itself. So that's the story. And when the dust settles on this Belt and Road, no one's going to remember it, and the bill is definitely going to come due. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this quick video about the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you liked it, please like it so more people can see it. And definitely, if you like these videos in general, subscribe and put on notifications so you don't miss any